This is my 42nd video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 16th, dealing with my third layout made using mainly Hornby EZ Track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby EZ Track layout when I already had an OO gauge layout using Bachmann EZ Track. This part, as promised, covers my build of the Metcalfe OO gauge brick goods shed kit, PO232. This was another fairly long build, so it will be a fairly long video. This is the kit as it comes in the standard Metcalfe packaging. This is a fairly thick package, though not quite as weighty as the 2-track engine shed I just built. I actually built the Metcalfe goods shed before in N gauge. Here it is on the corner of my N gauge layout. You can certainly get a lot more into a small space with N gauge. The OO gauge version of the goods shed is almost identical structurally to the N gauge version. Oddly, the OO gauge version comes with an extra small building in the form of a Weighbridge office. It's usually the other way round. N gauge kits generally include more buildings than OO gauge kits, which kind of makes sense as much less material is required for N gauge buildings. For example, the N gauge corner shop kit builds 2 corner shops, or 1 shop and a pub. The N gauge signal box kit builds a large box, a small box, and a bunch of huts. Anyway, here's the OO gauge package from the back, and you can see what it builds. You can also see my attempts to open the package. I'm not sure how you're supposed to open these Metcalfe packages. They don't have any dotted lines to tear or anything similar. Some of the early Metcalfe kits did, but no more. And the tabs are pretty firmly stuck down. I generally just slice the top open with a sharp knife, but I'm always a bit worried about potentially damaging the parts or slipping and hurting myself. When you get the parts out of the package, here's what you have. 3 folded sheets of printed card parts, 1 sheet of heavy card parts, 1 sheet of glazing parts, 1 sheet of something with roof trusses, and I'll come back to that later, a standard Metcalfe sheet of ridge tiles, and instructions in the form of 2 large folded sheets. I've said before that I'm not very fond of this large folded sheet format for instructions. The booklet format that Metcalfe have used for their more recent kits is much better. It's easier to work with, easier to handle and keep your place, and less likely to lead to confusion or missed instructions. This is apparently a slightly older kit, and it shows in a number of ways. I guess I'm a little spoiled because I just built the double engine shed kit, which has all of Metcalfe's latest features. Well, it's good that they keep improving things. As usual, there's no labelling printed on the heavy card, so I looked for the key in the instructions and penciled labels onto the heavy card. There aren't many heavy card parts in this kit, so there's not really much room for confusion there. Here's the first part out from its sheet, the main outer walls of the shed. Well, actually, this is 2 parts, 1 for each end of the shed. As usual with Metcalfe, all of the parts were pre-cut, retained in the sheets by a few partially cut lines which were labelled. Well, most of the lines that needed cutting were labelled. They seem to have forgotten to label some of them in this kit. And generally the parts of this kit needed a little bit more extra cutting to get them apart than is normal with Metcalfe kits. Here are those 2 parts separated and with their openings cleared. The small white tabs in the door openings are folded back and glued, but not the rest of the door tabs. The rest of the door tabs will fold around inside other parts in the subsequent assembly. These are the inner end walls of the main shed. The pieces at right came out of their openings. Since the instructions didn't mention them at this point, I put them aside for now. The pattern pieces representing the louvered vents at the top of the end walls are printed on the first instruction sheet as seen here. The louver pieces need to be cut out and glued behind the openings in the walls before those walls are folded double. After gluing the louvers behind the vents facing outward, the walls are folded double and the inner wall is glued to the outer wall. Here's one side of the first instruction sheet. The instructions are printed so that they go right across the sheet rather than separated onto the 2 pages where the sheet folds. So you can't work with the sheet folded, you have to have it opened out to properly see the instructions. Even with the sheet opened out, the order in which things are intended isn't always entirely clear. You need to pay attention to the figure numbering and read everything carefully. And honestly, in this kit there were several things that just weren't mentioned in the written instructions at all. So the next task is to glue the doubled end walls that were just assembled to the backs of the outer end walls, with the door tabs folded back around the inner walls and glued. I was a bit worried by this because the instructions stressed that there should be a groove down the side to accept the side walls, and I couldn't quite see how this was going to work. It turned out that everything was actually okay, as you'll see when I get to attaching the side walls. Next, the side walls need to be assembled. There were 3 card layers for each side wall, outer and inner printed parts with a heavy card part to be sandwiched in between. First, the printed outer walls were glued to the heavy card parts, taking care to keep the window and door openings lined up as precisely as possible. Next, glazing parts for the side walls need to be cut out. I cut out the glazing parts with scissors, as it seems to me that the acetate is not easy to cut well with a knife. The glazing parts are glued to the back of the heavy card parts, with their printed side facing out through the outer wall. These are very large glazing parts, making a layer in themselves, and so it's very easy to glue them without getting any glue on the visible window surfaces. Then the printed inner walls are glued in place, and the door tabs are folded round inside and glued. Now we come to attaching the side walls to the end walls. It turned out that when the instructions referred to the side wall fitting into a groove by the doorway, they just meant that the side wall would fit beside the pillar that was created by folding the doorway tabs around. So long as those tabs were folded around neatly, the remaining space up to the end of the end wall would be just wide enough to fit the 4 layers of the side wall. So the side wall is fitted up against the end wall there, and the decorative brick facing then folds around the outside of the side wall and glues down to the outside. Now the decorative facing from the other end wall is glued to the outside of the side wall, butting up against the facing from the first end wall. There is a little bit of an issue here. The 2 sets of brick facing are meeting in the middle of the side wall, perfectly butted up against each other. But when this is done, the side wall doesn't actually reach the other end wall. If you look carefully at the left end of the side wall here, you can see that there's a very distinct gap between the end of the side wall and the end wall. The only way to have got both ends of the side wall glued up against the end walls would have been to cut about 3/32 of an inch from the ends of the brick facing. I didn't do that. I just went with having the side walls not meeting the end walls at one end. Here you can see that gap from the inside. You can only see the gap at the top, since the pillar made by the door tabs hides it further down. The other side was just the same. Well, that's just as well, as otherwise the building wouldn't have been square. So I had to leave a gap at the end of the other side wall as well. The gap is at the right end of the side wall here. This is a bit odd, and I assume it results from Metcalfe not having got the measurements of their parts quite right. But it shouldn't really matter, as the gap isn't going to be visible from the outside when the building is complete unless you peer through the doorway and shine a light inside, and the connection of the walls is strong enough from the gluing of the facing to the walls without really needing a direct connection at the ends of the side walls. The next item is the inner platform, the trackside platform inside the shed. This has a tab on the edge which is folded back along the trackside edge, and then a straight wall piece is glued behind that folded tab and braced using a couple of pieces of scrap heavy card, and this is specifically what the instructions tell you to do. That platform is then supposed to be fitted inside the bottom of the shed with its extension protruding through the doorway. I couldn't get it to go into place at first. It turned out that this was because there was no gap for it at the bottom of the doorway. There was a thin piece of printed card at the bottom of the doorway opening in the outer side wall that was supposed to have been removed, but which I had missed removing. Well, it wasn't that obvious it was supposed to be removed. Once that thin piece of card was removed, and it needed to be cut at each end to remove it, there was a slot at the bottom of the doorway for the platform extension to pass through. Then it was possible to fit the platform inside the walls with the extension protruding through the doorway opening. At this point it was back to these parts, which came from the openings in the outer wall facing. The tabs popped out, and then they were folded in two and glued. The instructions referred to and showed in the illustration 3 tabs, but 4 were actually provided. I used all 4, gluing them around the bottom of the walls to provide support for the platform. The instructions indicated that the platform should be put in place first, and then the tabs should be glued to the side walls and the platform at the same time. I didn't like that idea, so I glued the tabs to the side walls first, as seen here, and then, once the tabs were firmly fixed to the side walls, I glued the platform on top of them. And here's that platform seen from above inside the shed. These are the parts for the main loading doors. The parts are folded in half to make doors with printing on both inside and outside. Then the doors are glued in place in the doorway opening. You could glue them in any position, closed or open, but I glued them mostly open as it seems a bit pointless to have detail inside the shed if you can't see it, not to mention being able to see wagons when they're inside the shed. I struggled a bit with this sheet for the roof trusses, which was largely my own fault, I'm afraid, as I didn't read the instructions carefully enough. These parts are intended to be something I've never encountered before in a Metcalfe kit. They're heavy card parts, much thicker than the regular printed card parts, printed on one side, and they're intended to be self-adhesive with a peel-off backing. Somehow you're intended to just peel the truss forward off the sheet. If you do that, I'm not sure what will happen to the pieces in the openings. Perhaps you'll be able to push them out after peeling the trusses from the backing. Anyway, I missed the point and cut the trusses out, cutting right through the backing. This really didn't have any terribly long-term bad effects, but it meant I wasted time and effort trying to do something I wasn't supposed to do at all. Somewhere around that point I realized that the parts had a peel-off backing and were self-adhesive, and I peeled off the backing and folded them in half. I must say it was pretty difficult to get them to stay folded in half. The self-adhesive glue wasn't very strong, and they kept popping apart again. I had to press them down for quite a while to get them to stay together. Then I used a dark brown marker to colour the edges, as there was a lot of card showing where the trusses were folded. The trusses then glued into place between the slots in the top of the side walls. I've never entirely understood why roof trusses are made so that they only contact the roof at their tops and their outer ends. The rest of the length of the tops of the trusses is recessed so that it doesn't actually touch the roof. I suppose there must be some real architectural reason for this. This is the main shed roof. It needs to have glazing parts attached before being glued in place. I took the time to shade its edges with a soft pencil at this point. The glazing parts are cut out and glued to the back of the roof. These parts have narrow borders along their length, so care needs to be taken to avoid getting glue on the visible surfaces. I glued the roof in place, centred over the end walls and the trusses, trying to get the overhang at the two ends as even as I could. These are the parts for the little extension roof over the loading doorway on the side. The side brackets for the extension roof are folded double and glued. The extension roof is glued up under the edge of the main roof, and then the brackets are glued on either side, supporting it. The extension of the inner platform through the doorway is folded under at the end and glued. I then coloured the edges of this platform extension with a brown marker. At this point I took the shed to the layout and tried it in the place where I intended it to go. Apart from anything else, I wanted to be sure that I attached the office to the correct end of the shed. The office can be attached to either end of the shed, but only one end was going to work properly with the way I intended to place the buildings. I then marked the end wall where I needed the office to be attached. Back on the bench, I started to assemble the office. Here are its main parts: walls, glazing parts, door, and inner floor. I folded all of the fold lines and glued the glazing parts to the back of the walls. The instructions don't actually mention glazing the office walls, although they do show the windows in place in the illustration. This is an example of how you can't always assume that the instructions are going to tell you everything that you need to do. I folded back all of the office wall tabs and glued them in place. Then I folded the walls around the inner floor. I glued the 3 continuous walls first and let that glue set. Then I folded together the back wall and joined it with a piece of scrap card. Unfortunately, my piece of scrap card was just a little too big, so I had to shave it a bit where it stuck up above the slanted top of the wall. Next, the office door was glued in place, and the tab outside the door was folded under and glued. These are the heavy card pieces for the chimney stack former. The 5 pieces are glued together to make a rigid square former. Then the chimney stack is folded around the former and glued. This was a very tight fit. The former had to be squeezed hard to make it fit inside the chimney stack at all, and so the stack had to be glued firmly and held for quite a while until the glue set. I had put that penciled X on the end wall of the shed when I took it to the layout to indicate the end on which I needed to attach the office. The instructions tell you at this point to glue back into that recess the piece of brickwork that you took from it right at the very beginning. It would be just too bad if you'd thrown it in the garbage and it was gone. Fortunately, I basically tend to save any vaguely useful-looking piece of scrap card, so I still had it on the bench. I glued the piece back into the recess. However, it didn't really fill the recess very neatly because of its bent edges from the original stamping. The office then glues onto the main building. Unfortunately, you can still see the edges where that piece was glued back in, but I suppose it won't be very noticeable. Now the office roof can be glued in place. These pieces are intended to make the steps up to the office door. Each piece needs to be folded double and glued. They tend not to fold exactly square, so you need to press the edges together as you glue them to keep them in line. They also tend to develop little fuzzy bits at the corners where they're folded. Those are annoying, so I tried to trim them off using clippers. I also coloured the edges with a black marker. Then the pieces glue one over another to make steps. When I tried the steps against the office, they weren't high enough to actually reach the platform by the door. So I marked a piece of scrap-heavy card to make an extra step. I cut that extra step out and coloured it with a black marker. With my extra step glued to the bottom, the steps seemed to just reach the doorway correctly. These are the pieces for the barge boards and their backing for the main shed and the office. 2 heavy card backing pieces are glued up under the edge of the roof, and then the barge board itself is glued on top of those backing pieces. The same is done for the other end of the roof and for the office roof, which has an asymmetrical barge board because of the chimney stack. These are the standard Metcalfe ridge tile pieces. They need to be folded in the middle. I use a steel ruler to help with this, and then their folds and edges need to be coloured. Unfortunately, the ridge tile pieces aren't long enough for the shed roof, so an extra piece has to be joined on. Now, ridge tiles are in place on the main roof and on the office roof. This is the piece for an outside platform. The tabs along the edges are continuous when the part comes from the sheet, and you need to cut out little V's by the fold for the ramp using a sharp knife, as I've done here. Then the tabs are folded over and glued. I've made a messy job of this with lots of glue, but that won't matter as this will be inside the bottom of the platform. There is a wall to fold around and make the edges of the platform and a folding support to go inside. Here is the platform assembled with its edge wall and its inner support. This platform doesn't really attach to anything and can be put wherever you wish. At this point I noticed this part. It wasn't mentioned in the instructions at all, but clearly it was intended to go around the steps up to the office door. So I glued that part around the steps. It does make them look better. These are the parts for the final building, the Weighbridge office. The Weighbridge office door has its small windows glazed. Also, the glazing part for the Weighbridge office window is glued to an outer frame. For some reason, in this case, the glazing part is way bigger than the part to which it glues, something I've never encountered before with Metcalfe glazing. The window with its frame glues inside the walls, and the tabs beside the doorway are folded back and glued. Then the door glues to those tabs, and everything is folded ready for assembly. The walls fold round and glue to an inner floor. I glued the continuous walls first. Then the back wall was closed and joined with the help of an inner card joiner, which was specifically provided in this case, whereas in other cases they just said to use a piece of scrap card. The chimney stack is done the same way as the other office chimney. Again, it needs to be pressed hard together and held for a good while as it's a very tight fit. Now the Weighbridge office roof can be glued in place. There are barge boards for this roof also. First, the backing strips are glued under the edges of the roof, and then the barge board glues to the backing strips. And there's an asymmetrical barge board for the other end by the chimney. Each chimney cap is made by gluing together 3 parts, which I can never seem to get entirely centered. And then the final challenge, the darn chimney pots. These parts need to be cut out from the instruction sheet. Then they need to be rolled into neat tubes as far as this is possible. I use a bamboo skewer for these 00 gauge pots. First I roll the skewer back and forth over the paper strip against my finger to start the strip curling. Then I roll the strip tightly round the skewer, keeping the edges lined up. When I've got it like this, I apply glue to that protruding flap and then roll the tube closed. I always get glue all over my fingers doing this. And here are the pots after that rolling. Then the edges of the pots need to be coloured as best as possible to hide the white edges, and the pots are glued onto the chimney caps. Finally, the chimney caps are glued to the tops of the chimney stacks. This is the finished Weighbridge office with the Weighbridge, which is just a flat card piece. And here is the whole thing in place on the layout. It fits where I wanted it fairly well. I probably need to remove a little ballast here and there to make the walls of the shed sit down better, but generally it doesn't look too bad. Here you can see the goods shed in context with the station and other buildings. Of course everything is rather cramped, this is a small layout. Here's the view including the previously built Metcalfe double-engine shed at the back corner of the layout. Probably my next build will be the Super Quick Railway Hotel, as that is the largest building still to come to go where that big white square template is now. Though I might do the Daypole plastic footbridge kit first, just to take a break from card kits.